The morning of February 20th, 1944, a Luftwaffe maintenance officer named Hauptmann Franz Stigler walked across the flight line at Leipheim Air Base in southern Germany. The sound he expected to hear, the usual dawn chorus of Daimler-Benz engines coughing to life, mechanics shouting tool requests, the metallic clang of cowling panels, was absent. Instead, there was silence. An unnatural, complete silence that made his boots on the frozen concrete sound obscenely loud. He counted the fighters lined up along the taxiway. 23 Messerschmitt Bf-109s the previous morning. This morning, 19 aircraft simply gone. Not transferred. Not in maintenance. Gone. Destroyed. And this was just one airbase, just one morning, in what would become the single most catastrophic week in the Luftwaffe's history. What German generals said when they realized what was happening wasn't recorded in triumphant speeches or confident directives. It was recorded in frantic telephone calls, in casualty reports that couldn't be believed, in the sudden, terrible understanding that the war in the air was already lost. The numbers were so staggering that even today they seem almost fictional. In 6 days, from February 20th to February 25th, 1944, the combined Allied air forces, American by day, British by night, destroyed or damaged over 1,000 German aircraft. Not over the course of months. Not in some far-flung theater. In 1 week. Over Germany itself. And the German High Command watched it happen with a mixture of disbelief, rage, and dawning horror. But to understand what they said, what they really thought as their air force disintegrated, you have to understand what they believed before that week began. The Luftwaffe in early 1944 wasn't supposed to be vulnerable. It was supposed to be resurgent. The myth started with the technology. By late 1943, German fighter production had actually increased despite years of Allied bombing. Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and other manufacturers were churning out roughly 1,000 fighters per month. The assembly lines at Regensburg, Leipzig, and Wiener Neustadt worked around the clock. New variants appeared constantly, the FW-198 with improved armor, the Bf-109 G6 with heavier cannon armament. The generals looked at these production figures and saw grounds for confidence. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, told Hitler in January 1944 that German air defenses were stronger than ever, that the Americans would break themselves against our fighters like waves against a cliff. General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch, in charge of aircraft production, reported that the bombing campaign against German industry had failed, that output was rising, that the Luftwaffe would soon achieve numerical superiority over the Reich itself. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Gorland, the fighter force commander and one of the few realists in the leadership, tried to inject caution into these assessments. But even he didn't grasp the scale of what was coming. The German defensive strategy relied on concentration. When Allied bombers appeared, fighters from multiple bases would scramble and converge on the bomber stream. The Americans flew in daylight, in tight formations, making them easy to locate and mass against. This had worked, more or less, throughout 1943. American losses had been severe. The Schweinfurt raids in August and October 1943 cost the 8th Air Force 60 and then 7 to 7 heavy bombers in single missions. The Americans seemed to be reaching the limits of what unescorted bombers could accomplish. The Germans knew the American B-17s and B-24s had defensive armament, up to 13 50-caliber machine guns per bomber, but massed fighter attacks could overwhelm them. The key was concentration, bringing enough fighters to bear simultaneously to break through the bomber formation's defensive fire. What the Germans didn't fully understand, what their intelligence had failed to grasp until it was too late, was that the Americans had solved their critical problem. Range. Throughout 1943, American fighter escorts could only accompany the bombers partway into Germany. The P-47s had a combat radius of about 175 miles. Adequate for missions to the coast, useless for deep penetration raids. The bombers went on alone into Germany, and the Luftwaffe slaughtered them. But in late 1943 and early 1944, everything changed. The P-38 Lightning appeared in larger numbers, with drop tanks extending its range to 440 miles. Then came the P-51 Mustang, a fighter that would fundamentally alter the air war. The Mustang's combat radius with drop tanks exceeded 660 miles. It could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. And it could fight. Unlike the P-47, which was essentially a rugged, high-altitude brute, the Mustang was fast, maneuverable, and deadly at all altitudes. When the first P-51 groups became operational in December 1943, German pilots noticed immediately. "They can follow us anywhere now," one Luftwaffe pilot wrote in his diary in January 1944. "Even when we dive away from the bombers, the Mustangs come after us. We can't escape to refuel and rearm anymore. They just keep coming." The German High Command received these reports but didn't grasp their implications. Göring dismissed pilot complaints as excuse-making. Gauland understood better. He'd flown against the new American fighters himself, but his warnings were ignored. The strategic reality was shifting beneath them, but institutional inertia and denial kept the leadership from responding effectively. Then came February 1944. The month itself was unusual. Typically, winter weather over northern Europe meant limited bombing operations. Heavy cloud cover, fog, ice, and storms grounded both attackers and defenders for days at a time. But February 1944 brought an unexpected stretch of clear weather. The meteorologists at Allied headquarters saw the forecast and recognized the opportunity. General Karl Tuispatz, commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, had been pushing for a concentrated campaign against the Luftwaffe itself. Not just against German cities or industrial targets, but against the fighter force, the planes, the pilots, the infrastructure that sustained them. He called it Operation Argument, though the aircrews knew it by a different name, Big Week. The plan was straightforward but ambitious. For as long as the weather held, the 8th Air Force would launch maximum effort raids against German aircraft production facilities. Every available bomber, every available fighter would go up. Day after day, overwhelming the German defenses through sheer numbers and aggression. Meanwhile, RAF Bomber Command would hit the same targets at night, giving the Luftwaffe no rest, no time to recover between attacks. On paper, it was sound strategy. In practice, it was a calculated risk. Concentrating the entire bomber force on aircraft factories meant flying into the most heavily defended areas of Germany. The Luftwaffe would respond with everything it had. Losses would be severe. But if the operation succeeded, if they could destroy enough of Germany's fighter production and enough of the fighters themselves, the way would be open for the invasion. The campaign began on February 20th, 1944. The target list was specific: the Messerschmitt factory at Leipzig, the Junkers plants at Bernburg and Aschersleben, the Focke-Wulf facility at Tutow, the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt. Over 1,000 American heavy bombers took off from bases across England, accompanied by nearly 900 fighters. The Luftwaffe response was immediate and massive. Every available fighter group scrambled. The radio frequencies filled with vectors and warnings. From bases across northern Germany, Bf-109s and Fw-190s clawed for altitude, forming up into swarms and Staffels, vectoring toward the incoming raid. What happened next shattered every assumption German commanders held about air combat over the Reich. The American fighters didn't just escort the bombers. They hunted. New tactics, authorized just weeks earlier, told American fighter pilots to leave the bomber formations and actively seek out German fighters. To pursue them. To follow them back to their bases if necessary. To kill them on the ground if they caught them landing. The Mustangs and Lightnings and Thunderbolts swept ahead of the bomber streams, found the assembling German formations, and tore into them before they could mass for coordinated attacks. Luftwaffe pilots suddenly found themselves fighting for survival rather than positioning for bomber attacks. And when they broke off to refuel or rearm, the American fighters followed them down. At Leipheim, Hauptmann Stigler watched from the control tower as 3 Bf-109s tried to land with American P-47s literally on their tails. One made it. The other two were shot down on final approach, exploding on the runway threshold. The field became unusable for 40 minutes while crews cleared the wreckage. At bases across Germany, similar scenes played out. Aircraft destroyed on landing. Aircraft destroyed on takeoff. Aircraft strafed in their revetments. The Americans were hitting the Luftwaffe not just in the air but on the ground, at their most vulnerable moments. The first day's losses were shocking. German records, compiled from base reports and unit diaries, showed 63 fighters destroyed in combat, another 43 damaged beyond immediate repair. Over 100 pilots killed, wounded, or missing. And that was just the beginning. February 21st brought another maximum effort. 900 bombers, 800 fighters. The targets were the same, aircraft production facilities, now burning from the previous day's attacks. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them again, throwing up every fighter that could fly. General Gorland, at his headquarters in Berlin, monitored the reports coming in from his units. The numbers made no sense. His fighters were shooting down American bombers. The kill claims that first day exceeded 100 B-17s and B-24s. But his own losses were catastrophic. Nearly 200 fighters gone in 2 days. 200. He picked up the phone to call Göring, to explain that they couldn't sustain this rate of attrition, that the Americans were using new tactics that neutralized the Luftwaffe's defensive advantages. Göring didn't want to hear it. The reports from the bombed factories showed severe damage. Yes, but they'd been bombed before. They'd rebuild. They always rebuilt. Göring tried to explain that the problem wasn't the factories. The problem was that they were losing pilots faster than they could train replacements, losing experienced formation leaders and flight instructors who couldn't be replaced at all. Then train them faster, Göring said. I don't want excuses. I want results. Göring hung up and stared at the map on his wall, at the colored pins representing his fighter groups. So many pins. Still so many units. But the reality behind those pins was eroding by the hour. On February 22nd, the weather briefly deteriorated. The Americans didn't fly. The Luftwaffe used the respite to count its dead, repair what could be repaired, and redistribute aircraft from quieter sectors. Replacement pilots arrived from training schools, young men with perhaps 100 hours total flight time, being thrown into combat against American pilots who often had 3 or 4 times that experience. One Luftwaffe training officer, watching a group of new pilots receive their combat assignments, remarked to a colleague, "We're sending them to die. They don't have the skills to survive even one combat. But what choice do we have?" February 23rd, the weather cleared again. The bombers came back, nearly 1,000 of them, hitting Schweinfurt, Gotha, Eisenach. The escorts came with them, aggressive, hunting. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything that could fly. The combat reports from that day read like casualty lists from a ground battle. Jagdgeschwader lost 11 aircraft. Jagdgeschwader 11 lost 16. Jagdgeschwader 26, the famous Geschwader with a distinguished lineage stretching back to the Spanish Civil War, lost 14 fighters and 7 pilots killed. But the numbers on paper didn't capture what was happening psychologically to the Luftwaffe's fighter force. The pilots were exhausted. They were flying multiple sorties per day, scrambling to intercept one raid, landing to refuel and rearm, then scrambling again for the next wave. Sleep became a luxury measured in hours snatched between alerts. Food was whatever could be grabbed from the mess hall before the next scramble order came. And always, the Americans kept coming. Not sporadically, not in easily predictable patterns, but constantly, in overwhelming numbers, with fighters that could follow you anywhere. The Luftwaffe pilots had faced heavy odds before, over Britain in 1940, over the Eastern Front, over the Mediterranean. But this was different. This was the Americans bringing their industrial capacity directly into the sky over Germany and simply overwhelming the defenders through sheer abundance. One Luftwaffe pilot, Oberleutnant Heinz Noack, recorded his experience on February 23rd in his diary. "We scrambled at 0900 hours. Engaged bombers near Gotha. Shot down 1 B-17 before the Mustangs found us. Eric was killed. Simply vanished in a ball of fire when a P-51 got on his tail. Landed at 10:45. Refueled. Scrambled again at 11:30. The bombers were still coming. How do they have so many aircraft? Where do they all come from? We fought until our ammunition was gone, then ran for home with the Americans chasing us. Karl didn't make it. Shot down on approach to the field. I saw his parachute. At least he got out. Landed at 1300 hours. Too exhausted to eat. The alarm went off again at 1400 hours. A third mission in one day. I don't know how much longer we can do this. At Luftwaffe High Command, the reports created a surreal disconnect between the strategic situation and official pronouncement. The daily briefings maintained a veneer of confidence. Yes, losses were heavy, but the Americans were losing bombers. Their production facilities were being damaged. The situation remained manageable. Privately, the staff officers looked at the casualty figures and did the mathematics. At the current loss rate, the fighter force would be combat ineffective within weeks. Not defeated in some decisive battle, but simply ground down to nothing through cumulative attrition. General Gunther Korten, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, convened an emergency meeting on the evening of February 23. The attendees included representatives from fighter operations, training command, aircraft production, and logistics. The purpose was to assess whether the Luftwaffe could continue defending the Reich at the current operational tempo. The production officer reported first. The attacks on aircraft factories had destroyed or severely damaged multiple critical facilities. The Messerschmitt plant at Leipzig was effectively out of commission. 3 halls completely gutted by fire, machine tools destroyed, assembly jigs twisted by blast damage. The Junkers facility at Aschersleben had lost 2/3 of its production capacity. Erler Maschinenwerk in Leipzig, which assembled Bf-109s from subcomponents, had been hit so hard that production wouldn't resume for at least 6 weeks. The immediate loss wasn't total fighter production. Germany's aircraft industry was dispersed across multiple sites, but the disruption was severe. February's production would fall short by perhaps 300 aircraft. March would be worse unless repairs could be expedited. The training officer's report was grimmer. Pilot losses over the past 4 days exceeded 150. Not all were deaths. Some were wounded, some were prisoners after being shot down over German territory and captured by advancing ground forces, but all were losses the training pipeline couldn't replace quickly. The Luftwaffe had established an accelerated training program, cutting corners on flight hours and advanced combat training to get pilots to operational units faster. But these inadequately trained pilots were dying at even higher rates than experienced aviators, creating a vicious cycle. "We're burning through our seed corn," the training officer said bluntly. "Every instructor we lose is 50 future pilots who won't be properly trained. We're approaching a point where we won't have enough qualified instructors to maintain even minimal training standards." The fighter operations officer presented the tactical situation. American escort tactics had fundamentally changed. Previously, the fighters stayed close to the bombers, reactive and defensive. Now they operated aggressively, independently, hunting German fighters throughout their operational area. Luftwaffe formations couldn't assemble without being attacked. Airfields were being strafed. Damaged aircraft trying to make emergency landings were being hunted down and destroyed. "The Americans have achieved air superiority over the Reich itself," he said. The words hung in the air. No one contradicted him. General Korten asked the obvious question, "Can we regain it?" The silence was answer enough. Finally, Gorland, who'd been invited despite being technically outside the command structure, spoke, "Not with current tactics. Not with current resources. The Americans have more aircraft, more pilots, more fuel, more everything. And they're using their advantages intelligently. Every sortie we fly costs us aircraft and pilots we can't afford to lose. Every sortie they fly, they replace their losses within days." "So what do you recommend?" Korten asked. "We conserve the force. Stop trying to meet every raid with maximum effort. Husband our experienced pilots. Focus on defending truly critical targets and accept that we can't defend everything. And we need the new fighters, the jets, operational as soon as possible. The Me-262 is the only aircraft we have that can match the American fighters' performance." Göring, when briefed on these recommendations, rejected them entirely. "Conservation meant surrender," he said. "The Luftwaffe would fight. Every raid would be contested. The American losses would mount until they couldn't sustain the campaign. The jets would arrive eventually, but until then, the conventional fighters would hold." It was a decision rooted more in ideology than military reality. Göring couldn't admit that the Luftwaffe was being defeated. His entire position, His status within the Nazi hierarchy rested on the Luftwaffe's strength. To acknowledge weakness was to invite his own downfall. So the orders went out: continue maximum effort defense. Contest every raid. Accepting defeat in the air was unthinkable. On February 24th, the weather was perfect. Clear skies, unlimited visibility. The Americans launched another 1,000-bomber raid, this time targeting Schweinfurt again, along with Gotha and Rostock. Over 800 fighters escorted them. The Luftwaffe put up everything that could fly. From bases across northern and central Germany, every available fighter scrambled. The formations assembled under constant harassment from American escorts, took heavy losses climbing through them to reach the bombers, suffered more casualties during the actual bomber attacks, and then were pursued relentlessly during their withdrawals. At Leipheim, Hauptmann Stigler watched his unit disintegrate. They'd started the week with 28 pilots and 31 aircraft. By February 24th, they had 11 pilots fit to fly and 9 serviceable aircraft. The others were dead, wounded, or missing. The aircraft were destroyed, damaged, or simply worn out from continuous operations without adequate maintenance. He flew 3 missions that day. On the third, his Bf-109 took 20mm cannon hits from a P-51. He managed to nurse the damaged fighter back to base, but the aircraft was a write-off. After landing, he walked to the operations room and found the commander, Major Hartmann, staring at the mission board. "How many did we lose?" Stigler asked. 3 confirmed. 2 more didn't come back. We don't know if they crashed or landed elsewhere. Major Hartmann's voice was flat, emotionless. Tomorrow they want us to fly again. With what? Stigler gestured toward the window, toward the flight line where only a handful of fighters remained. We have 6, maybe 7 airworthy aircraft left. Half our pilots are gone. They're sending us replacements. Should arrive tonight. The way Hartmann said replacements made it clear what he thought of the barely trained youngsters who'd be thrown into combat within hours of arrival. February 25th brought the final day of Big Week. Another maximum effort. The targets were familiar by now: Augsburg, Stuttgart, Regensburg. The Messerschmitt factories that hadn't been destroyed yet. The Luftwaffe scrambled again. By this point, exhaustion and losses had degraded the German response. Formations were smaller, less coordinated. Experienced leaders were dead or wounded, replaced by men who'd been flight leaders days earlier and were now trying to command entire squadrons. Radio discipline collapsed as inexperienced pilots called out every threat, flooding the frequencies with useless chatter. The American fighters swept through the disorganized German formations like scythes through wheat. The bomber gunners, who'd faced desperately aggressive attacks earlier in the week, found themselves with fewer targets. The German fighters were there, but in smaller numbers, less coordinated, easier to fend off. When the last American formations turned for home that afternoon, the week was over. 6 days of continuous, maximum effort operations. The most intense aerial combat yet seen in the war. The Luftwaffe compiled its casualty reports over the following days. The numbers were staggering. Official records showed 355 fighters destroyed in air combat or on the ground. Another 292 damaged, many beyond economical repair. Over 400 pilots killed, wounded, or captured. But these official figures understated the real damage. Many aircraft listed as damaged would never fly again. Many pilots listed as wounded would never return to combat. And the psychological impact, the exhaustion, the demoralization, the growing certainty among frontline pilots that they were fighting an unwinnable battle, couldn't be quantified in casualty reports. General Gorland compiled his own assessment for the High Command. His report, classified most secret, laid out the situation without euphemism. The Luftwaffe has suffered a strategic defeat. In 1 week, we have lost more aircraft and experienced pilots than in the previous 3 months combined. American air superiority over the Reich is now absolute. Without immediate and drastic measures, including withdrawal of substantial fighter forces from other theaters and acceleration of jet fighter production, we cannot prevent the Americans from bombing German industry at will. The report went to Göring, who forwarded it to Hitler with his own assessment. Göring's version was more optimistic. Losses had been heavy, yes, but the Americans had also suffered. Over 150 bombers destroyed, perhaps 300 damaged. The aircraft production facilities would be rebuilt. The pilot training program would be expanded. The situation was serious but manageable. Hitler accepted Göring's assessment. The alternative, acknowledging that Germany had lost control of its own airspace, was unthinkable. The war would continue. The Luftwaffe would recover. The new weapons, the jets, the rockets, the advanced piston fighters under development, would turn the tide. But at the operational level, among the pilots and ground crews and tactical commanders who faced the daily reality of American air superiority, there was no such optimism. They knew what had happened during Big Week. They'd watched it happen. They'd lived it. Hauptmann Stigler, who'd started the week with a full squadron and ended it with barely enough aircraft for a single staffel, wrote in a letter to his brother, "They tell us we're winning. That we just need to hold on until the new weapons arrive. But I was there. I saw what they did to us. We couldn't stop them. We threw everything we had at them, and they just kept coming, day after day, and there was nothing we could do. How do you win when the enemy has unlimited aircraft, unlimited pilots, unlimited everything? How do you win when you watch your friends die in ones and twos and threes, day after day, and know that tomorrow will be the same, and the day after that, until there's no one left?" The questions were rhetorical. Stigler knew the answers. Most of the pilots knew. The high command either knew and wouldn't admit it, or didn't know because they couldn't bear to look directly at the truth. Big Week marked the turning point in the air war over Europe. Not because it destroyed the Luftwaffe entirely, German fighters would continue flying until the war's end, but because it broke the Luftwaffe's ability to prevent Allied bombing operations. After February 1944, the question wasn't whether American bombers would reach their targets, but how much resistance they'd face getting there. The strategic implications were immense. With air superiority established, the Allies could prepare for the invasion of France without fear of Luftwaffe interference. They could bomb transportation networks, fuel depots, communications centers, systematically isolating the invasion beaches from German reinforcements. The success of D-Day in June 1944 owed much to the fact that the Luftwaffe was too weakened to contest Allied air superiority over Normandy. But the human cost of Big Week, on both sides, was enormous. The Americans lost over 250 heavy bombers and nearly 30 fighters during those 6 days. 2,500 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. These weren't abstract statistics. Each bomber carried 10 men. Each fighter, 1. Each loss was a crew that had trained together, flown missions together, and in many cases, died together. The difference was that America could absorb these losses. New bombers rolled off assembly lines in Seattle, Burbank, and Fort Worth at a rate Germany couldn't match. New crews graduated from training programs in Texas, Arizona, and Florida every week. The lost aircraft were replaced within days. The lost crews, within weeks. Germany couldn't do the same. The aircraft factories that Big Week targeted never fully recovered their production capacity. Pilot training, already compressed and inadequate, became more so as the demand for replacement pilots outstripped the training establishment's ability to supply them. The experienced cadre of pre-war and early war pilots, the men who'd fought over France, Britain, Russia, the Mediterranean, were dying off, and the replacements arriving at operational units often had barely 100 hours total flight time. What German generals said when Allied bombers destroyed 1,000 planes in 1 week varied by their position and perspective. Göring said it was temporary, that Germany would recover. Gaulle said it was catastrophic, that fundamental changes were needed immediately. Korten said it was serious but manageable if resources were allocated properly. But what they all knew, even if some wouldn't admit it publicly, was that Big Week had demonstrated something undeniable. American industrial capacity, applied strategically and ruthlessly, could overwhelm German defenses through sheer abundance. The Luftwaffe could fight brilliantly, and individual German pilots and units did fight brilliantly throughout Big Week. But brilliance couldn't compensate for being outnumbered 3-1, or 5-1, by an enemy who could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. In the spring of 1944, German fighter pilots began seeing a new phenomenon. American bombers would approach with such overwhelming fighter escort that attacking them meant near certain death. Some pilots developed the tactic of making one firing pass from high altitude, then diving away at maximum speed before the escorts could react. It was safer, but it meant each German fighter got perhaps one chance to damage a bomber before fleeing. Hardly an effective defensive strategy. Others simply avoided combat when the odds were too heavily against them. This wasn't cowardice. These were men who'd proven their courage repeatedly, but rational calculation. Dying pointlessly in an unwinnable engagement didn't help Germany. Better to survive, conserve the aircraft, wait for a more favorable opportunity that might never come. The generals saw these reports and understood their implications. The fighter force wasn't just being destroyed physically. It was being defeated psychologically, learning through bitter experience that contesting American air superiority meant death without meaningful impact on the bomber streams. In late March 1944, a young Luftwaffe pilot named Lieutenant Gunther Specht was shot down over Bavaria. He bailed out and was found by local farmers who took him to the nearest Luftwaffe base. The base commander, curious about the newest pilot replacement, asked about his training. Specht had 60 hours in fighters. 60. The commander asked what combat tactics he'd been taught. Specht could describe basic formation flying and gunnery against towed targets. He'd never been taught how to attack a bomber formation through defensive fire. He'd never been taught how to evade American fighters. He'd been given an aircraft, told to join a unit, and sent into combat against pilots who had 200, 300, sometimes 400 hours of flying experience plus months of actual combat operations. "How long do you think you'd survive?" the commander asked. Specht didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew. Maybe 3 missions. Maybe 5 if he was very lucky. Then he'd be dead or wounded or captured, and another 60-hour pilot would take his place, and the cycle would continue until Germany ran out of young men willing to climb into fighters. That evening, the base commander wrote a report to his superiors outlining the situation. He noted that sending inadequately trained pilots into combat against overwhelming odds wasn't a sustainable strategy. He recommended either improving training standards, which would mean accepting lower replacement rates, or withdrawing fighters from combat to preserve them for some future operation when odds might be better. The report was filed and ignored. There was no time to improve training. There was no stomach for withdrawing forces. The war continued, and young men like Lieutenant Specht kept climbing into Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs and dying in droves. By May 1944, 3 months after Big Week, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm had become a shadow of its former self. It still had aircraft. Production had actually increased in some categories as dispersed factories came online, but it lacked experienced pilots, adequate fuel, and most critically, the organizational cohesion that made a fighter force effective. Units that had been elite Jagdgeschwaders with distinguished combat records were now filled with replacement pilots who barely knew each other and hadn't trained together. The complex tactics that required coordination and mutual trust broke down. Formations became looser, less effective. Combat became increasingly individual, each pilot fighting his own desperate battle rather than operating as part of a coordinated unit. What the German generals said about all this, in their private correspondence and post-war interrogations, revealed men who understood they'd been beaten but couldn't quite articulate how or why it had happened so completely. They'd had fighters. They'd had pilots. They'd had bases and radar and early warning systems. But the Americans had simply brought more of everything, used it more aggressively, and ground down the Luftwaffe through cumulative attrition that no amount of German tactical skill could counter. Gorland, in his post-war memoir, wrote, "Big Week was the end, though we didn't admit it at the time. Not the end of the Luftwaffe, we kept flying until the last days of the war, but the end of our ability to prevent the enemy from doing whatever he wanted in the skies over Germany. After February 1944, we were reacting, surviving, dying in place. We were no longer a strategic force. We were just targets." It's perhaps the most honest assessment any German general gave of what happened when Allied bombers destroyed 1,000 planes in 1 week. Not just the physical destruction, though that was catastrophic. Not just the pilot losses, though those were irreplaceable. But the psychological breaking of a force that had once considered itself invincible, that had dominated the skies over Europe from Poland to France to the Mediterranean, and found itself suddenly, completely, overwhelmingly defeated by an enemy with infinite resources and the will to use them. The Luftwaffe would continue fighting for another 14 months. Individual German pilots would score victories, sometimes impressive ones. New aircraft like the Me-262 jet fighter would appear and cause temporary consternation among Allied pilots. But the strategic situation never changed. After Big Week, the Allies owned the sky over Europe. The rest was just details, painful details written in the lives of young men on both sides, but details nonetheless. When the war ended in May 1945, American investigators found thousands of German aircraft hidden in forests, dispersed to tiny airfields, or simply abandoned at major bases. Many had never flown. They'd been produced in factories that escaped bombing, but there was no fuel to operate them, no trained pilots to fly them, no organizational structure to employ them effectively. The destruction hadn't required destroying every aircraft. It had only required destroying the system, the training pipeline, the experienced cadre, the logistical support, the confidence that made the aircraft meaningful military assets. Big Week had started that destruction. The following months had completed it. What German generals said when they saw it happening was complicated. Some blamed Göring for mismanagement. Some blamed Hitler for strategic decisions that drained resources from air defense. Some blamed the German aircraft industry for not producing the jets sooner. Some blamed the pilots for not fighting hard enough, a particularly cruel accusation given how desperately those pilots had fought and died. But underneath all the blame and recrimination and post-war analysis, there was a simpler truth that most eventually acknowledged. They'd been beaten by an opponent with greater resources who used those resources intelligently and ruthlessly. The Americans had brought their industrial economy into the sky over Germany and demonstrated that quality and courage, while admirable, ultimately couldn't overcome quantity when that quantity was employed with skill and determination. In the end, what German generals said when Allied bombers destroyed 1,000 planes in 1 week wasn't recorded in dramatic speeches or defiant pronouncements. It was recorded in casualty reports, in frantic telephone calls, in desperate requests for reinforcements that never came, in the gradual, grudging realization that they'd lost the air war and with it, any realistic hope of winning the ground war that would follow. The silence at Leipheim that morning in February 1944. The unnatural quiet where there should have been engine noise and activity, was the sound of defeat. Hauptmann Stigler heard it and understood what it meant. So did thousands of other Luftwaffe personnel at bases across Germany. The question wasn't whether they'd been beaten. The question was how long they'd have to keep fighting a war they'd already lost. For most of them, the answer would be another year of combat, another year of watching friends die, another year of knowing that every mission might be their last. That was what Big Week really destroyed. Not just aircraft and pilots, though it destroyed plenty of both. It destroyed hope. And in war, sometimes that's the most important thing an enemy can take from you.